The sun bled out across the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust, and in that dying light, she saw the impossible. The sand began to move, not the subtle shift of wind-driven grains, not the cascade of a collapsing dune face, but something deliberate, something alive. The surface rippled like muscle beneath skin, rising in a slow, searching arc that defied every law of nature she'd ever learned. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the column of sand lift itself 20 feet into the air, swaying back and forth as though tasting the evening wind, as though hunting. And she knew, with the cold certainty that comes from being prey, that it was searching for her. Her name was Kara, though names meant little in a place that swallowed identities as easily as it swallowed footprints. She'd been walking for 11 days through this wasteland, her water supply reduced to a single canteen that sloshed with barely a cup's worth of liquid. The pack on her shoulders had grown lighter with each passing mile, emptied of everything but essentials, and even those were running out. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin burned dark despite the makeshift head wrap she'd fashioned from a torn shirt. The knees of her cargo pants were shredded from a fall 3 days ago when she'd scrambled down a rocky outcrop, and the bruises beneath had turned the color of storm clouds. But she was alive. Against every odd this desert had thrown at her, she was still moving, still breathing, still fighting. The silent dunes stretched in every direction, an ocean of sand frozen in waves that reached toward the darkening sky. She'd crossed into this region 2 days ago, leaving behind the broken highway and the scattered debris of civilization that had marked her path from the crash site. The helicopter had gone down in a sandstorm, its rotors shredded by winds that had appeared out of nowhere, its fuel line ruptured by the impact that had killed the pilot instantly. She'd crawled from the wreckage with a dislocated shoulder, a gash across her forehead, and the knowledge that rescue wasn't coming. The emergency beacon had been destroyed in the crash. The radio was dead. She was alone in the vastness, with nothing but her survival training and a stubborn refusal to die in this God-forsaken place. The silent dunes earned their name. No birds called here. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed muted, as though the desert itself absorbed sound, swallowed it down into the infinite grains that stretched to every horizon. In the terrible quiet, her footsteps seemed obscenely loud, the crunch of sand beneath her boots like gunshots in a cathedral. She'd tried singing to herself on the first day here, just to break the oppressive silence, but her voice had sounded so small, so lost, that she'd stopped after a single verse. The quiet pressed against her eardrums, made her hyper-aware of her own heartbeat, her own ragged breathing. It was the kind of silence that made you understand how truly alone you were. But now, as the sun touched the horizon, and the sky began its transformation from blue to purple to black, the silence took on a different quality. It became waiting, expectant, and that's when she saw the sand move. She'd stopped on the crest of a dune to catch her breath and assess her options. The desert rolled out before her in endless undulations, each ridge casting long shadows in the failing light. She'd been hoping to spot some landmark, some feature that might indicate water or shelter or any break in the monotonous landscape. Instead, she saw the impossible. The disturbance began about 200 yards ahead, in the trough between two massive dunes. At first, she thought it was a dust devil, one of those miniature tornadoes that sometimes spun up in desert heat. But the movement was wrong. Dust devils were chaotic, spinning columns of air and debris. This was controlled, purposeful. The sand gathered itself from the surface, accumulating, rising in a thick column that maintained its coherence even as it climbed higher. It swayed at its apex, bending like a snake's head, like something with eyes searching the landscape. Kara's hand went instinctively to the knife sheathed at her belt, a useless gesture against something made of sand. But the motion gave her some small comfort. Her pulse hammered in her temples. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain still. Movement attracted predators. That was basic biology. And whatever this thing was, predator seemed like the right word. The column of sand bent toward her direction. She couldn't say how she knew it was focused on her, but she felt it the way you feel eyes on your back in a crowded room. The attention of something vast and alien and hungry. The column swayed, contracted slightly, then extended again, reaching higher, as if trying to catch her scent on the wind. But there was no wind. The air hung heavy and still, waiting. She took a careful step backward, placing her boots slowly to avoid making noise, though what sound could possibly matter to something made of sand, she didn't know. The column continued its serpentine motion, bending and weaving. And then, with a movement so fast she barely registered it, the column collapsed back into the desert floor, the sand settling as though nothing had ever disturbed it. The silence rushed back in, deeper than before. Kara stood frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape for any further movement. The dunes remained still, the shadows lengthened. The first stars began to prick through the deepening blue above. She waited a full minute, then two, every muscle tense, ready to bolt. Nothing moved. Maybe she'd hallucinated. Dehydration could do that, trick the mind into seeing things that weren't there. She'd been rationing her water carefully, but 11 days in the desert took a toll. Maybe the heat, the exhaustion, the constant stress had finally broken something in her perception. Maybe the sand column had been nothing more than a fevered vision, but she didn't believe that. Her instincts, honed by years in hostile environments, told her otherwise. Something was out there, something that moved beneath the sand, that could raise itself up and search and hunt. And now that the sun was setting, now that darkness was claiming the desert, she was exposed and vulnerable and utterly alone. She needed shelter, needed it desperately. Her eyes swept the landscape, looking for anything that might offer protection. In the failing light, she spotted something about a mile to the east, a darker shadow against the dunes that might indicate rock formations or ruins. The desert was full of buried structures, ancient buildings swallowed by the sands centuries ago. If she could reach one, if she could find walls and a roof, she'd at least have something solid between her and whatever had risen from the sand. She started moving, descending the dune in long, sliding strides, her boots sinking deep with each step. The sand hissed around her ankles, poured into her boots despite the laces being pulled tight. She'd long ago given up trying to keep sand out of everything. It infiltrated every fold of clothing, every pocket, every crevice. It was in her hair, grinding between her teeth, coating the inside of her nostrils. The desert claimed you piece by piece, grain by grain, until you became part of it. The temperature was dropping rapidly now that the sun had vanished. The desert's cruelty was like that, burning you alive during the day, freezing you at night. She'd need to find shelter before the temperature plummeted further, before hypothermia became as much a threat as dehydration. Her body was already compromised, already pushed to its limits. She couldn't afford another night sleeping exposed on the open sand. She reached the bottom of the trough and started up the next dune, her thighs burning with the effort. Climbing sand was exhausting work, each step sinking, sliding backward, requiring twice the energy of normal walking. Her breath came in harsh gasps. Sweat that she couldn't afford to lose dampened her shirt beneath the pack, but she pushed on, driven by the primal need for safety, for walls, for something more substantial than open air and infinite sand. Halfway up the dune, she felt it, a vibration through the sand, transmitted up through the soles of her boots. A subsonic rumble that she felt more than heard, a frequency that resonated in her chest cavity and made her molars ache. She froze, her heart rate spiking into panic territory. The vibration came again, stronger this time, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from directly beneath her feet. The sand around her boots began to shift, not dramatically, not the violent upheaval she'd witnessed before, but a subtle motion, grains sliding sideways, creating tiny depressions that spiraled inward. She was standing on top of something moving. Kara exploded into motion, scrambling up the dune face, clawing at the sand with both hands when her feet couldn't find purchase. Behind her, the sand began to churn, to rotate like water circling a drain. The vibration intensified, became a low-frequency hum that she could hear now, an alien sound that had no place in the natural world. She didn't look back. Looking back would cost precious seconds. She hauled herself up the dune through sheer force of will, her shoulders screaming in protest, her lungs burning. She crested the ridge and threw herself over, rolling down the far side in a controlled tumble that sent her pack flying and filled her mouth with sand. She came to rest at the bottom, gasping, spitting, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. She forced herself to her hands and knees, crawled forward several yards, then collapsed onto her back, staring up at the stars that now speckled the sky in their millions. The rumbling had stopped. The desert was silent again. She lay there for long minutes, waiting for her heartbeat to slow, listening for any sound that might indicate pursuit. But the night remained quiet. Eventually, she sat up, retrieved her pack from where it had fallen, and took inventory. Nothing broken. The precious water canteen still intact. She allowed herself 3 small sips, letting the liquid sit in her mouth before swallowing, trying to rehydrate the swollen tissues of her tongue and throat. The darkness was nearly complete now. The desert transformed into an alien landscape of silver and shadow beneath the starlight. The temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees since sunset, and she was beginning to shiver. She pulled a thin emergency blanket from her pack, the kind that folded down to the size of a credit card, but supposedly reflected 90% of body heat. She wrapped it around her shoulders, knowing it would do little good, but unable to afford the energy of constant shivering. The dark shadow she'd spotted earlier was closer now, maybe half a mile distant. In the starlight, she could make out distinct edges, angles that were too straight to be natural formation. Ruins. Definitely ruins. The desert was full of them, the remnants of civilizations that had tried to claim this land and been swallowed for their hubris. Most were pre-colonial, ancient structures built by people whose names had been lost to time. Some were more recent, 20th century attempts at desert outposts or research stations or military installations, all eventually abandoned when the desert proved too harsh, too vast, too implacable. She stood, her legs protesting, and started toward the ruins. The sand was firmer at night, cooled and compacted, making walking slightly easier. She moved carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, hyper-aware of every sensation beneath her boots. If there were creatures that could move through sand, that could create columns and hunting disturbances, then the ground itself was no longer trustworthy. The ruins resolved themselves into a small complex of structures, maybe 5 or 6 buildings clustered together, their walls rising from the sand like broken teeth. The architecture was old, possibly Spanish colonial, thick adobe walls that had somehow survived centuries of sandstorms and desert heat. Most of the roofs had collapsed, leaving only walls and the occasional arch still standing. But one structure, the largest, seemed mostly intact, its roof damaged, but still providing cover. Kara approached cautiously, every sense alert for danger. Ruins attracted more than just shelter seekers. Snakes loved the cool spaces beneath fallen stones. Scorpions made homes in crevices and shadowed corners. And if there were larger predators in this desert, predators made of sand and malevolent intelligence, then ruins might be exactly where they'd hunt, knowing that desperate travelers would seek them out. She circled the main building, examining it from all sides before approaching the entrance. The wooden door had long since rotted away, leaving a dark, rectangular opening that exhaled cool air that smelled of stone and age and something else, something organic and unsettling. She pulled out her flashlight, a small LED model that had been on her belt during the crash, its battery depleted to maybe 20%. She couldn't afford to waste it, but she also couldn't afford to walk into a scorpion nest or worse. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing an interior surprisingly intact. The roof had a large hole toward the back, open to the stars, but the front half remained covered, protected. The floor was stone, mostly swept clean by wind that had found its way inside over the years, though sand had drifted into corners and against walls. There was debris, broken pottery, rotted wooden beams, scraps of unidentifiable material, but no sign of current animal habitation, no dropping, no nests, no bones. She stepped inside, playing the light across the walls. They were thick, at least 2 feet of adobe brick, the kind of construction meant to keep heat out during the day and hold warmth during the night. Exactly what she needed. The space was roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with 2 small window openings high on the walls. Too small for anything large to enter through. There was a doorway in the back wall leading to another room, but Kara decided to ignore it for now. This space was defensible, visible, and felt as safe as anything was going to feel tonight. She moved to a corner farthest from both the main entrance and the roof opening, positioning herself where she could see both points of vulnerability. She shrugged off her pack, set it beside her, and arranged herself with her back against the solid wall. The stone was cold but reassuring. She pulled the emergency blanket tight around her shoulders and allowed herself another 2 small sips of water. The exhaustion hit her then. a wave of fatigue so profound it felt like gravity had doubled. Her body was at its limit, running on adrenaline and stubborn will. She knew she needed to eat something, to give her body fuel, but the thought of chewing was almost too much effort to contemplate. She had 2 protein bars left in her pack, along with a handful of dried fruit and some salt tablets. She forced herself to eat half of one bar, washing it down with another precious sip of water, mechanically chewing and swallowing without tasting. The night deepened around her. Through the hole in the roof, she could see the slow wheel of stars, the Milky Way a bright splash across the sky. More stars than she'd ever seen in her life, the kind of celestial display only possible in places far from human light. It was beautiful in a terrible, indifferent way. The universe didn't care if she lived or died. The desert didn't care. Those stars would shine whether she saw another sunrise or became bleached bones beneath the sand. But she cared. She wanted to live. Wanted it with a fierceness that surprised her, given how much easier it would be to just give up, to lie down and let the desert take her. But something in her refused. Some core of stubbornness or pride or simple human defiance that wouldn't let the wasteland win. She must have dozed, because she jerked awake to a sound. Her hand went immediately to her knife, her eyes snapping open, trying to orient herself in the darkness. The flashlight had rolled away when she'd fallen asleep, its beam painting a useless circle on the far wall. She grabbed it, swept the light toward the entrance. Nothing. The doorway was empty, framing a rectangle of starlit desert. But she'd heard something. She was certain of it. A scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across stone. She held her breath, listening, the silence pressing against her eardrums. There, again. A soft scraping, coming not from the entrance but from the back room. From beyond the doorway, she'd decided not to investigate. Her stomach clenched. She should have checked the entire structure before settling in. Basic survival protocol. But she'd been so exhausted, so desperate for rest, that she'd taken a risk. And now something was in here with her. She rose slowly to her feet, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, and moved toward the back doorway. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of this enclosed space and take her chances in the open desert. But the memory of that sand column, of the vibration beneath her feet, of the churning drain of sand that had nearly swallowed her, kept her moving forward. Whatever was in the back room, she needed to know, needed to assess the threat. The doorway led to a smaller room, maybe 10 feet square, this one with no roof at all, completely open to the sky. The starlight was bright enough to see that the room was empty except for a pile of rubble in one corner, and she stopped, her breath catching. The floor of the small room was moving, not dramatically, not violently, but definitely moving. The sand that had accumulated here over the years was shifting, flowing toward the center of the room where there was a depression, a hole maybe 3 feet across. The sand poured into this hole in a steady stream, like water circling a drain, and as it vanished into the darkness, more sand flowed in from the edges to replace it. Kara took a step back, her hand tightening on the knife handle. The hole was feeding something below, or something below was pulling the sand down. Either way, this ruin sat on top of something active, something that moved through the substrate of the desert like a shark through water. The scraping sound came again, louder now, and she realized it wasn't coming from the hole, but from beneath her feet, from below the stone floor of the main room where she'd been sleeping. The floor vibrated, a deep subsonic pulse that made her teeth ache. Dust sifted down from the remaining roof beams. She backed toward the entrance, keeping her eyes on the hole, on the flowing sand, on the walls that suddenly seemed far too thin, too fragile. The vibration intensified. The scraping became a grinding sound. Stone on stone, something massive moving beneath the ruins. And then the floor of the main room buckled. It didn't collapse all at once, didn't give way in a catastrophic failure. Instead, the stone tiles lifted in the center of the room, pushed up from beneath by something enormous. The tiles cracked, separated, creating gaps through which sand began to pour upward, defying gravity, vomited from whatever existed below. Kara ran. She burst through the entrance into the night, sprinting away from the ruins without looking back, her pack abandoned, her only thoughts on distance and survival. Behind her, the grinding sounds intensified, became a roar like thunder, like an avalanche, like the earth itself splitting open. She ran up the nearest dune, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, ran until she reached the crest and finally allowed herself to look back. The ruins were collapsing inward, the walls tilting and falling as the ground beneath them gave way. But it wasn't a simple cave-in. The sand around the structures was moving, flowing inward in massive rivers, as though the desert itself was swallowing the buildings. And in the starlight, she could see something beneath, something vast and pale and segmented, like the coils of some enormous worm or serpent, writhing as it consumed the ruins and everything in them. The grinding roar faded. The movement slowed. Within minutes, the ruins had vanished completely, swallowed by sand that smoothed itself over the spot as though nothing had ever existed there. The desert was still again, peaceful. The only sound, the hammering of Kara's heart in her ears. She stood on the dune crest, shaking, watching, waiting for some further sign of the thing that moved beneath the sand. But the desert offered nothing. It had taken the ruins and whatever lay beneath them, and now it waited, patient and eternal, for the next foolish traveler to trust its surface. Her pack was gone. Everything she'd carried, water, food, supplies, all of it swallowed with the ruins. She had the clothes on her back, the knife at her belt, the flashlight in her hand, and nothing else. The situation had gone from desperate to potentially lethal. Without water, she had maybe 2 days before dehydration killed her. Without food, she might last a week, but she'd be so weak by then that it wouldn't matter. The cold bit through her shirt, and she realized she'd lost the emergency blanket too. The desert night would be brutal now. She started walking, choosing a direction at random because any direction was as good as another when you had no map, no compass, no destination. She walked to generate warmth, to prevent her body temperature from dropping too far, to keep moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant accepting the reality of her situation. She walked through the night, the stars wheeling overhead, the sand endless beneath her feet. The cold was intense, but the movement kept hypothermia at bay. Her throat burned with thirst, her tongue swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding. She'd heard that drinking your own urine could buy you time in survival situations, but she'd also heard it could hasten kidney failure. She wasn't desperate enough for that yet. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening in the east, transforming from black to purple to pink to blazing orange. With the light came the heat, the temperature climbing rapidly, transforming the night's freezer into a daytime oven. Kara found a rock outcrop, a rare vertical feature in the landscape, and crouched in its small shadow, trying to escape the direct sun. She knew she needed to conserve energy, to avoid moving during the hottest part of the day. But the rock's shadow was small and would shrink as the sun climbed higher. The landscape here was different from the silent dunes. The sand was darker, studded with rocks and sparse, dead vegetation. In the distance, maybe 5 miles away, she could see what might be mountains, a darker line against the sky that could indicate higher ground, different terrain, possibly even water. It was a long shot, but it was something, a goal, a reason to keep moving. She waited out the worst of the morning heat, dozing fitfully in the inadequate shade, her body starting to show the signs of severe dehydration. Her urine had turned dark amber hours ago. Now she couldn't urinate at all, her kidneys shutting down, preserving what little fluid remained in her system. Her skin had lost its elasticity, staying pinched when she tested it. Her thoughts were becoming fuzzy, disconnected, her brain struggling to function without adequate water. By noon, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. The shadow had vanished completely, the sun directly overhead, and staying here would only cook her more efficiently. She stood, swayed, caught herself against the rock, and started walking toward the distant mountains. The sand burned through the soles of her boots. The air shimmered with heat, creating mirages that showed lakes and pools of water that vanished as she approached. Her vision swam, doubled, tried to shut down entirely. She walked because stopping meant dying. It was that simple. The human body could endure remarkable things when the alternative was death. She'd seen soldiers march for days with broken bones, sailors survive weeks adrift in lifeboats, climbers descend mountains with frostbitten limbs. The body had resources it kept in reserve, emergency reserves that came with terrible costs, but could keep you alive just a little longer. The sun tracked across the sky. The mountains remained distant, refusing to draw closer no matter how far she walked. She began to suspect they were a mirage themselves, a cruel trick of heat and light and dying brain cells. But she had no other option, no other hope, so she walked toward them anyway. Afternoon bled into evening. The heat began to ease. The shadows lengthened. And as the sun touched the horizon, as the desert prepared to transform from furnace to freezer once again, Kara crested a dune and saw the structure. It was large, much larger than the ruins from the previous night, a sprawling complex of buildings that covered at least an acre. The architecture was different too, modern, or at least more recent, concrete and steel instead of adobe. Some kind of research station or military outpost, long abandoned from the look of it. The buildings were half buried in sand, their windows dark, their doors hanging open or missing entirely. But they were solid, they were shelter, and they represented the first real hope she'd felt in days. She descended the dune toward the complex, her legs barely functioning, each step a negotiation with muscles that wanted to quit. The first building she reached had been some kind of garage or vehicle depot, large enough to house trucks or construction equipment. The roof had partially collapsed, but one corner remained intact. She stumbled inside, out of the direct sun, and collapsed against a wall. The temperature drop was immediate and profound. The concrete walls held the cool of the previous night, radiated it into the space. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and when she opened them again, the light had changed. She'd lost time, maybe an hour, maybe more. The sun was setting, the interior of the garage filling with shadows. She needed water. That was the only thought that mattered. If this had been a research station or outpost, there might be storage tanks, might be supplies left behind, might be something that could save her life. She forced herself to stand, to move deeper into the complex, checking each building methodically despite the exhaustion that made her limbs feel like lead. The third building had been living quarters. Bunks lined the walls, their mattresses long since rotted away. There were lockers, footlockers, debris that might once have been furniture. She searched through it all, hoping for bottled water, canned food, anything. She found rat droppings, sand and decay. Nothing useful, nothing that would keep her alive. The fourth building had been a laboratory or research facility. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces covered in sand, and the desiccated remains of papers and equipment. Microscopes sat like sculptures, their lenses filmed with dust. There were refrigerators, but they'd been unplugged for years, their contents long since spoiled and evaporated. There were cabinets with chemical bottles, most empty or filled with crystallized powder that might once have been solutions. And in the back corner, there was a sink. Kara stared at it, almost unable to process what she was seeing. A simple stainless steel sink, with a faucet and a drain. She approached it, like a religious pilgrim approaching a shrine, hardly daring to hope. She reached out, gripped the faucet handle and turned it. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The facility was abandoned, the water lines long since drained. But she tried the other handle anyway, tried them both, working them back and forth desperately, and a cough, a sputter, a thin stream of rust-colored water that sprayed from the faucet, stopped, then flowed in a weak but steady trickle. Kara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She cupped her hands beneath the flow, watched the rusty water pool in her palms, and brought it to her mouth. It tasted of metal, and minerals, and age, but it was liquid, it was wet, it was salvation. She drank until her shrunken stomach protested, then drank more, letting the water spill down her chin and throat, soaking her shirt. The flow weakened after a few minutes, became a drip, then stopped entirely. Whatever reservoir had fed it was exhausted, but it had been enough. Not enough to fully rehydrate her, but enough to pull her back from the immediate edge of death. Enough to buy her time. She slumped against the wall next to the sink, her body beginning the process of absorbing the water, distributing it to tissues that desperately needed it. Her headache eased slightly. The fuzziness in her thoughts began to clear. She could feel her body coming back online, systems that had been shutting down now cautiously reactivating. Night had fallen. The laboratory was dark, except for the starlight filtering. She clicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam around the space, and noticed something she'd missed before. A door in the back wall, metal, solid, with a small window, a sign faded, storage, authorized person, storage, supply, equipment, possible water. She crossed to the door, tried the handle. Locked. But the lock was old, and the door frame was corroded. She braced her boot against the wall and pulled hard on the handle. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th pull, the corroded screws holding the strike plate tore free and the door swung open. The room beyond was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, lined with metal shelving units. And the shelves were full. Boxes and containers and sealed bags. Supplies that had been stored here when the facility was abandoned. Kara swept her flashlight across the inventory, hardly believing her luck. There were MREs, military-style meals ready to eat, in vacuum-sealed packages. There were plastic bottles of water, though most had been drained or evaporated, leaving only a dozen or so that still held liquid. There were first aid kits, batteries, emergency blankets, flares, rope, and, her heart leaped, a hand-crank emergency radio. She grabbed a bottle of water first, broke the seal, and drank half of it in desperate gulps. Then she tore open an MRE, any MRE, not caring what it contained, and stuffed food into her mouth. The meal was decades old, the texture wrong, the flavor questionable, but it was calories, it was protein, it was fuel. She ate mechanically, washing down each bite with water, feeding her starved body. When she'd consumed one entire MRE and started on a second, when she'd drunk 3 bottles of water and could feel her stomach starting to protest the sudden influx, she finally allowed herself to stop and take inventory properly. There was enough food here for maybe 2 weeks if she rationed carefully. There was enough water for a week, possibly 10 days. There were supplies that could help her survive, help her plan, help her find her way out of this nightmare. She tested the hand-crank radio, winding it vigorously, and was rewarded with a crackle of static. She cycled through frequencies, finding nothing but empty hiss on most channels. But on one frequency, she picked up something. Faint, distant, but definitely human voices. A transmission, though too degraded to make out words. It proved that there was still a world beyond this desert, still civilization, still hope of rescue if she could just figure out where she was and how to signal for help. Kara hauled supplies from the storage room into the main laboratory, setting herself up a base camp. She used emergency blankets to create a nest in one corner, positioned where she could see all entrances. She organized the food and water within arm's reach. She laid out the first aid kit and treated her various wounds. The cut on her forehead that had scabbed over but showed signs of infection, the scraped knees, the blistered shoulders where her pack straps had rubbed. She was methodical, efficient, taking care of her body the way a mechanic would service a vital machine. The night deepened. The complex around her was silent, but it was a different silence from the silent dunes. This was the silence of abandonment, of human spaces reclaimed by the desert, filled with the ghosts of whoever had worked here before. She wondered what they'd been researching, what had brought them to this hostile place. She wondered if they'd encountered the creatures that moved beneath the sand, if that's why they'd abandoned the facility. She was contemplating trying to sleep when she heard it. A sound from outside, from somewhere in the complex. A scraping, like she'd heard in the ruins, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. Her hand went to her knife. She grabbed the flashlight, clicked it off immediately, not wanting to give away her position. She moved to one of the windows, peered out into the night. The courtyard between buildings was visible in the starlight, an open space of cracked concrete and drifted sand. And crossing that courtyard, moving from shadow to shadow, was something that shouldn't exist. It looked like a serpent, like the sand columns she'd seen, but solid, physical, its body as thick as an oil drum. Its surface was pale, almost luminous in the starlight, covered in what might have been scales or segments or plates of chitin. It moved in an undulating wave, its body creating the scraping sound as it dragged across the concrete. And though it had no eyes that she could see, no obvious sensory organs, it moved with purpose and direction, searching. Kara pressed herself against the wall next to the window, hardly breathing. The creature, if that's what it was, crossed the courtyard and vanished behind the garage building. The scraping sound faded. The night returned to silence. She waited, counting seconds, then minutes, listening for any indication that the thing was returning. But the complex remained quiet. Eventually, she allowed herself to slide down the wall into a sitting position, her legs unable to support her weight any longer. She'd known, intellectually, that something was down there, beneath the sand. The evidence had been undeniable, but seeing it above ground, seeing it solid and physical and hunting, drove the reality home in a way that observation couldn't. These creatures were real. They were massive, and they hunted on the surface as well as below it. She couldn't stay here. The facility might have supplies, but it was clearly within the creatures' hunting range. They knew these buildings, probably used them as landmarks or gathering points. She needed to move, needed to take what supplies she could carry, and get far from here. But she also needed rest, needed to let her body recover from its ordeal before attempting another crossing of the desert. She decided to give herself 12 hours. She'd rest through the night, sleep in shifts, monitoring the complex for creature activity. Then, at first light, she'd pack what she could carry and leave, heading for the mountains she'd seen from the dune crest. Higher ground meant different terrain, possibly escape from whatever ecological niche these sand creatures occupied. She set a mental alarm, years of military training allowing her to wake at specific times without external aids. Then she wrapped herself in emergency blankets, positioned her knife where she could grab it instantly, and allowed herself to drift into a light doze, her subconscious mind listening for danger while her body desperately tried to repair itself. She woke twice during the night to sounds: the scraping of creatures moving through the complex, the groan of metal stressed by something heavy, the whisper of sand pouring into spaces where it shouldn't be. Each time, she froze, listened, waited for the sounds to pass. Each time they did, the creatures completing their patrols or hunts or whatever drove them, then retreating back beneath the surface. When dawn finally came, painting the laboratory walls with pink light, Kara allowed herself to fully wake. She ate another MRE, drank more water, feeling her body growing stronger with each meal, each hour of rest. She packed a makeshift bag from canvas she found in the storage room, filling it with as many supplies as she could carry without being overburdened. Food, water, first aid, the radio, batteries, a length of rope, matches, a tarp. Everything that might make the difference between survival and death. She took one last look around the laboratory, this place that had briefly been sanctuary, then stepped out into the dawn. The complex looked different in daylight, less ominous but more desolate. The buildings were in worse shape than she'd realized. The concrete cracked and crumbling, the steel reinforcements rusted through in places. Sand had drifted against every wall, climbed halfway up some structures, nature reclaiming what humans had tried to impose on the desert. She moved through the complex carefully, checking each shadow, each doorway, alert for any sign of the creatures. But the morning was quiet. Whatever hunted in the night apparently retreated with the sun, returned to the cool depths beneath the sand where the heat couldn't touch them. She reached the edge of the complex and paused, looking out at the desert that stretched ahead. The mountains were visible, closer than they'd seemed yesterday, maybe only 3 or 4 miles distant. They rose dark and jagged from the sea of sand, a different kind of terrain entirely. If she could reach them before nightfall, she'd be out of the worst of the creature's range. Mountains meant rocks, cliffs, caves that were truly solid, not the treacherous shifting substrate of sand. Kara adjusted her makeshift pack, tested its weight, found it manageable. Then she took her first step away from the complex, back into the wasteland, and started walking. The morning was cool, the temperature bearable for now. She made good time, her body responding better now that it was fed and hydrated. The sand here was firmer, mixed with gravel and rocks that had washed down from the mountains over millennia. Her boots found better purchase, allowing her to maintain a steady pace. By mid-morning, the mountains had resolved into distinct features. She could see canyons cutting into their flanks, see exposed rock faces, see what might be vegetation clinging to higher elevations. Water. There had to be water up there, somewhere. Springs or seasonal streams, or at least moisture collected in rock basins. The vegetation proved it. She was 3 miles from the complex when she felt the first vibration. It came through the ground, subtle at first, then stronger. The familiar subsonic pulse that made her teeth ache and her chest cavity resonate. She stopped, her heart rate spiking, and scanned the landscape around her. The sand was moving. Not dramatically, not yet, but she could see the surface shifting, see grain sliding over grain, creating patterns that spiraled and flowed. The vibration intensified, and then, 100 yards ahead, the sand began to rise. It formed a column, just like she'd seen that first night in the silent dunes, but faster, more aggressive. The column shot upward, thick as a tree trunk, climbing 20 feet, 30 feet, higher than before. At its apex, the sand seemed to crystallize, to take on coherence and solidity, becoming something more than loose grains held together by motion, and then it bent toward her. Kara ran. She ran toward the mountains, toward the one place the creatures might not be able to follow. Her pack bounced against her spine, the weight threatening to topple her, but she didn't dare drop it. The supplies meant survival. Without them, even reaching the mountains would be pointless. Behind her, the sand column collapsed and reformed, closer, cutting off her retreat back to the complex. More vibrations pulsed through the ground. More columns began to rise, 3 of them, 4, forming a loose ring around her position, herding her, corralling her like prey. She ran harder, her lungs burning, her legs pumping, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. The mountains were close now, so close, the rocky slope less than half a mile ahead. If she could just reach it, just get to solid ground. The sand erupted directly in her path. Not a column, but a mass emergence, the creature itself bursting from the substrate in an explosion of sand and violence. She got her first clear look at it in full daylight, and the sight nearly stopped her heart. It was enormous, easily 40 feet long, its body segmented like a centipede or worm, each segment covered in pale, chitinous plates. It had no eyes, no obvious head, just a circular mouth lined with concentric rings of teeth that spiraled inward into darkness. The creature reared up, its body forming an arch that towered over her, blocking her path to the mountains. Sand poured from its segments, cascaded from its mouth, the grains clinging to mucus or secretions that coated its body. It swayed, tasting the air, searching, and then it lunged. Kara threw herself sideways, rolling through sand and gravel, her pack torn from her shoulders by the impact with the ground. The creature's mouth crashed down where she'd been standing, its teeth grinding against rock, leaving gouges in stone. It withdrew, swayed, searching for her again. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed her pack, and ran at an angle, no longer heading directly for the mountains but trying to get around the creature, trying to find a gap in the ring of columns that surrounded her. The creature tracked her movement, its body coiling, preparing for another strike. The columns began to collapse, the sand flowing inward, multiple creatures converging on her position. There was no way out. She was surrounded, the creatures coordinating their hunt with terrifying intelligence. In seconds, they'd be on her, their mouths finding her, pulling her down into the sand where she'd disappear without a trace, just another vanished traveler consumed by the desert. Then she saw it, a crack in the nearest mountain slope, a vertical fissure in the rock face maybe 30 feet away. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was solid rock, real stone, not sand. The creatures couldn't follow her there. Couldn't. She sprinted toward it with everything she had left, her body running on fumes and desperation. Behind her, the large creature lunged again, its momentum carrying it forward, its mouth opened wide. She felt the displacement of air as it passed inches behind her, felt the spray of saliva and mucus across her back. She hit the rock face, found the crack, and squeezed herself into it as the creature's mouth slammed into the stone with a sound like a wrecking ball hitting concrete. The fissure was tight, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she had to abandon her pack to fit through. She wriggled deeper, the rocks scraping her arms and back, cutting through her shirt, but she didn't stop. She pushed herself into the mountain, into darkness, into safety. Behind her, the creature's teeth scraped against the fissure opening, trying to widen it, trying to reach her. The sound was terrible, like knives on a chalkboard multiplied 1,000 times. The creature roared, a subsonic bellow that resonated through the stone and through her body, a sound of frustration and rage. But it couldn't reach her. The fissure was too narrow, the rock too solid. After several minutes of scraping and bellowing, the sounds began to retreat. The vibrations faded. The creature was withdrawing, returning to the sand, retreating from the solid stone that marked the boundary of its domain. Kara continued deeper into the fissure, following it as it angled upward into the mountain. After about 50 feet, the passage widened into a small cave, maybe 10 feet across, with a ceiling high enough for her to stand upright. Light filtered in from somewhere above, a natural shaft that brought daylight into the space. The air was cool and still and smelled of stone and minerals and nothing organic, nothing alive. She collapsed onto the cave floor, her body finally giving out, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. She'd lost her pack, lost all her supplies, except for the knife at her belt and the flashlight that had somehow remained clipped to her waistband. But she was alive, against all odds, against everything this desert had thrown at her. She was still alive. She lay on the cold stone, staring up at the shaft of light, listening to her heartbeat slowly return to normal. Her body hurt in more places than she could count. She was dehydrated again, hungry again, injured in a dozen ways. But she was alive, and she'd made it to the mountains. Over the next hours, as the sun tracked across the sky and the light shaft moved across the cave floor, Kara explored her refuge. The cave extended deeper into the mountain, a network of passages that wind-carved stone. She found evidence of water, mineral stains, damp spots, the sound of dripping from deeper in the complex. She followed the sound and found a small pool, maybe 2 feet across, fed by a slow drip from a crack in the ceiling. The water was clear and cold and tasted of minerals but was otherwise clean. She drank until her stomach hurt, letting her body absorb the liquid, rehydrating tissue that had been operating on the edge of failure. Then she explored further, mapping the cave system in her mind, finding multiple entrances to the surface, finding spaces that could serve as shelter, finding a place where she could survive while she figured out her next move. That night, safely ensconced in her mountain cave, Kara sat near the small pool and assessed her situation. She'd lost her supplies, but she had water. She had shelter. She had her knife and basic tools. The mountains had vegetation, which meant animals, which meant food if she was patient and resourceful. She could survive here, could recover, plan, eventually find her way to civilization or signal for rescue. The desert creatures couldn't reach her here. The solid stone protected her, marked a boundary they wouldn't or couldn't cross. She was safe, for now, in this liminal space between the wasteland and the sky. She thought about everything she'd seen, everything she'd survived. The crash, the endless walking, the silent dunes, the ruins that had tried to swallow her, the research complex, the creatures that hunted beneath the sand. This desert was more than just a harsh environment. It was an ecosystem, a living system with predators and territories and rules she was only beginning to understand. And she'd survived it. Barely, at the cost of almost everything, but she'd survived. She pulled out the emergency radio. Miraculously, it had been clipped to her belt alongside the flashlight and had survived the mad dash to the mountains. She wound it up, cycled through frequencies, and found that same faint signal she'd heard before, still too degraded to understand, but present, proof of a world beyond this nightmare. Tomorrow she'd climb higher, look for a vantage point, try to get her bearings. She'd figure out where she was, plot a course, make a plan. But tonight, she allowed herself simply to rest, to let her battered body begin the process of healing, to acknowledge that she'd done what she'd needed to do to stay alive. The desert had tried to kill her in a dozen different ways, but she was still here, still fighting, still refusing to become another victim of the wasteland. And that would have to be enough. If you want to follow more survival journeys through hostile deserts where the sand itself hunts, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival. Tell me in the comments, which moment shocked you most? When the ruins collapsed beneath her, or when she first saw the creature emerge in full daylight? Your thoughts fuel these stories from the edge of survival.